Welcome to The Outlet, an NBA podcast hosted by Nick Fay and Kory Waldron.
On this episode of The Outlet, Kory and I are joined by Jac Manuell to continue our top 25 unrestricted free agents. As always, you can catch The Outlet on all streaming platforms. Enjoy the show. All right, guys, we made it to the top 10. Kicking off the top 10, we got Goran Dragic, who just played in the NBA Finals. Wasn't fully healthy, but he had a really nice postseason before that injury. Thoughts on him and what he can bring to a team in 2020, 2021?
What I want to hear first is Kory Waldron say Goran Dragic.
Goran Dragic.
Was it bad? Not bad. Anyway, Goran Dragic is likely, in my eyes, to get a one-year lump sum.
Yep.
He proved himself as a Miami Heat culture guy. He was awesome. The heart that he showed to push through that plantar fascia injury. All of us here saw that video of him sort of try to get it for Game 5 and then eventually stood up a little bit for Game 6. Absolute warrior. And he deserves it. You know, he is one of the more intriguing and valuable point guards currently available. You know, I'm sure a team like the Clippers would love to have him. A team like the Philadelphia 76ers would love to have him. But I think the cost, and I think it seems to me, you know, in off-season photos that I've seen of Goran Dragic hanging overseas, wherever he is now in his native home, he might be in, is he Serbian? Or wherever he is right now in Europe. I've seen him in, like, you know, Miami Heat sweatshirts and all this sort of thing. So to me, I'd be very surprised if Pat Riley lets him go. But, you know, another team, you know, Steve Ballmer has that money and, you know, he's paying everyone. He's got the Microsoft money. And if he were to offer anyone a huge lump sum of cash, Goran Dragic would be a perfect fit.
Yeah, the good thing for the Heat, sorry to cut you off, Kory, is that not many teams that are contending have any cap space. Because I think if the Clippers were to have any money, it'd probably be the mid-level exception, which is around like $9 million. So that puts the Heat in a pretty good position. But go ahead, Kory.
I mean, Dragic, right? That
Close
better?
enough, you're good.
That worse or better?
That's
Call him
probably
Goran.
GD.
The Dragon.
The Dragon. Yeah, the Dragon. I feel pressure now from Jac. Obviously, Goran Dragic is a very good vet, right? Going to be 34 years old. Is 34 years old as of May 6th of 2020. The only issue with Dragic is going to be what his price tag is at, because again, this year he was a 6 Man of the Year candidate for much of the year for the Miami Heat. Obviously, started playing starter minutes come playoff time. But Dragic has proven that he can do a little bit of everything. He can score, he can facilitate, he can, you know, shoot from deep, he can get to the rim. He's a jack of all trades. Now the only issue is, you know, what does that look like price-wise? And I think Miami probably makes the most sense for a guy like Goran Dragic because he's really bought into the, as you mentioned, Jac, the culture, and the bromance between him and Jimmy Butler is very real. And I just have a hard time picturing him going anywhere else. And I also feel like because Dragic got such a taste of being so close to the NBA Finals, obviously we didn't see him for a majority of the NBA Finals. I feel like it's almost like a run it back type of mentality where I could see him taking a lesser deal to stay with Miami just so he can stay with this group of guys, because it did feel like this team was very united throughout the season, especially come playoff time.
Yeah, actually, Dragic has a nice interview with Woj on his podcast, which I listened to before the bubble started or around that time. And he talked about how much he likes the Heat culture and Spoelstra and how they do things in Miami and how it's such a good fit. And like you said, Kory, he's a guy that gets along really well with Jimmy Butler. I think, like Jac mentioned off the top, though, I think the one-year deal for a large sum from Miami makes the most sense. And I think that's what they want to do, because then they get to keep their cap space for 2021. They still are good going to this next season because Dragic was a really good player for them. He was their third best player in the postseason. I think that'd probably be pretty easy to say. You know, maybe in the finals it's different because he was injured, but still. And like you said, Kory, he can do a little bit of everything. He's a high basketball IQ guy, veteran point guard, can run the show, can run the pick and roll, hit the three ball. Defense isn't amazing, but it's still competent enough out there. He is getting up there in age. You know, the injury definitely doesn't make you feel super confident about it, but if it's a one-year deal going back to Miami, I think that's just the most likely scenario, because it just seems like he's a guy, based off of that interview I heard with Woj, wants to win. He's probably not going to go to a bad team. The only other team that I could see really trying to make a run at him would be Dallas. because Dallas had an interest in the past. There's a relationship with Luka Doncic. That could be something where maybe they try to get a sign and trade going or something like that, because that was a trade. I don't know if you guys recall it, free agency last year.
I do remember.
Yeah. It was a rumor to be completed, and then in the last second, somebody pulled out, and then Dragic ended up staying in Miami. So he's an interesting guy and one of the best point guards on the market in this free agency class.
Some shooting by distance. I'm going to keep dropping these stats.
Oh, wow. We've got Corey's. He's an Andre Drummond stan, and now he's a shooting by distance dude. Let's get some threads going, Corey.
It's the orange polo.
We're having some fun. So Goran Dragic shot 69% within 3 feet of the hoop.
69% is always a good number.
On long twos, 16 feet to the three-point line, 50%. So this was a guy who excelled at the long twos, only shot under 40% from mid-range. So when it comes to 10 to 16 feet, not great. And also shot 40% on corner threes. Also a very good number.
Yeah, that's some impressive stuff. And like we said, it just makes sense for Miami to keep him, given where he's at in his career and that whole situation, and how unknown the cap situation and things are going to be for a lot of teams in the NBA. But any other thoughts on Dragic before we move on?
Where does he shoot, Corey, from 0.8 feet to 0.2 feet? What's the
That's now you're getting a little bit too technical. I only got like 6 different brackets here.
We need to get that synergy money.
Yeah.
I hope he gets healthy. That's all. I hope he gets healthy and stays healthy. That's the biggest thing. Yeah. It was obviously unfortunate that he got hurt at such a bad timing when he was obviously playing so well for the Miami Heat. And of course, the question mark I'm sure a lot of Miami Heat fans and the Miami Heat themselves are asking themselves is, if Goran Dragic is healthy, do they win that series? Or if Bam Adebayo is healthy with Goran, do they win that series? And I'm sure it's going to be a question that kind of influences how they go about this offseason.
Yeah, as good as Dragic is, I think even if he played or Bam played, I think the Lakers are still winning that series. But it would have been a lot more fun, a lot more competitive. And the plantar fasciitis is something to keep an eye on because it does linger, if it doesn't correctly heal. And given the news we had today, it looks like the NBA could be back by Christmas time. So keep an eye on that. Moving on to number 9, we got Danillo Gallinari. Thoughts on him?
Hey, you said it wrong there, Nick. Danillo Gallinari.
Danillo Gallinari. There was probably a little lag, Jack. Come on, relax.
Don't blame lag.
Relax. I've been watching basketball before you. I know who Gallinari is.
Coming for you.
I've come for everyone who mispronounces European or international names.
We came for you when you didn't know that Tim Hardaway Jr. was on the Hawks. So
that's fair.
Fair enough.
A lot of shots being fired in the top 10 here. I like it.
But Gallo, obviously, OKC had a great year. These last 2 seasons, probably the healthiest of his entire career, and maybe the 2 best seasons of his entire career. You could make the argument for that. And a guy who's mentioned that he wants to go to a contender, but I saw another report today from an interview saying that he would be okay staying in OKC or going to a situation helping young guys. So I'm not sure how much we can buy into that, hey, I want to go to a contender thing. If the money talks, the money talks.
He didn't look like he wanted to go to he didn't look like he wanted to stay in OKC when he was photoshopping himself on Twitter with just the blank question mark jersey.
It kind of looked like a Nets jersey, to be honest.
Yeah, it looked like he was out of OKC in a minute. But I mean, people are welcome to change their minds. It's totally fine if and if OKC do decide to retain him. He had some decent moments in the postseason. He also did get caught out a couple of times in the Houston series as well. But I thought overall, I've always been a big Danilo Gallinari. Maybe not as big a Danilo Gallinari stan as Corey is an Andre Drummond stan. But on one of my second or third podcasts doing an off-season preview for the LA Clippers, I was like, you know what? I don't mind this deal for the Clippers. $21 million. You guys are all down in the drain about it.
Yeah, it only took trading Blake Griffin and DeAndre Jordan for it to work.
3 years later, look where we are.
Let's just backtrack too. He only played 21 games that season, so we were also correct because he didn't play that entire year, basically. So
I don't need. Hey, who brings, as my Lord and Savior Kevin Durant would say, who brings statistics to a hoop argument? Please.
It wasn't statistics. He only played 21 games.
That's a statistic to me.
Katie would tell you got to show up. You got to play the games. But just saying on Gallinari, I wasn't too impressed with his play in the bubble and the postseason. I don't know if he was just kind of a little bit out of sorts, but I thought he was better during the regular season. What are you thinking, Corey?
Yeah, I mean, Danilo Gallinari. Is that okay for you? Was that good, Jack?
You got some Italian in your blood.
Yeah, so he's good. Let's just be clear. When it comes to what you're looking for in the modern NBA, he can't really play the small forward anymore. That's just defensively, that's an issue for him. But when it comes to stretch fours, Gallinari is a guy you want from the stretch four because he can provide shooting, in the three-point line, outside the three-point line, can still get to the rim decently well, and isn't as much of a liability when it comes to playing the four. And health has been the biggest upside for him the last 2 years after that first year in the Clippers where he only played 21 games. So he's finally healthy, and we've also are seeing that Gallinari can play impactful, winning basketball. Because again, these last two teams that he's been a part of haven't really had star power. They've been a by committee sort of team where it's, it may be Gallinari one night, might be, Lou Williams last year one night, might be Chris Paul one night this year, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. So he's been with a lot of well-rounded teams. It makes sense for him to want to go to a contender because, again, he's going to be 32 years old. He's getting to the back half of his career. And when you start to look at the injury history for him, you do have to have some concern about what the longevity of his career looks like as he gets farther down the road. I don't see him back in OKC. I think that for me personally, I just don't see it making sense for OKC. And I feel like they want to
letting go of Billy Donovan.
Right, I mean? Especially have to let go of Billy Donovan, which signals rebuild to me, clear-cut rebuild coming. So what happens with a guy like Chris Paul, I think might even more signify what happens with Gallinari. If we were to see Chris Paul move, then Gallo is definitely not coming back. And I just think there's a lot of contending teams that will definitely look to Gallinari. Like the Miami Heat, for example, if they wanted to throw 1 year money at Gallinari, he probably shares up some of their offensive issues at the 4 possibly.
He almost ended up in Miami, but he didn't want to take the contract extension at the deadline. So that was a guy that they almost acquired.
Even better little tidbit by you, Nick. Thank you for the drop. I think Gallinari is a guy, is going to garner a lot of free agent activity.
And an interesting thing with him would be, sorry to cut you off, Jack, would just be the sign and trade possibility because that's what OKC is looking for. Hey, let's acquire another asset. Let's acquire another millionth draft pick or another young player to our team to see what we can do. So I think Gallo's an intriguing guy. The question mark is like, where does he kind of fit on your team? How much can you count on him in closing time? Just because like some of those moments in the Houston series just linger in my head because it's so fresh, and I just feel like at times they needed him to be better, but he couldn't be better. So I think you don't want to necessarily depend on him, but if he's a guy that can provide value and impact to your team in like a smaller role as that 4th or 5th starter, maybe even a 6-man type thing, that's where I think you look at Gallinari. I don't think you want to be one of your top 3 offensive options, just given that he's a little inconsistent.
Honestly, just to piggyback off of your point of how he struggled in this past postseason, he's honestly struggled every year in the postseason. Last year with the Clippers, only had shooting splits of 35, 30, and 84. This past year, 40, 32, and 96. It's good from the free throw line, but definitely some worrisome shooting splits the last couple of years in the playoffs, despite having really good regular seasons.
Yeah, I think the team outside of Miami that makes a lot of sense is Milwaukee for me.
Yeah.
Obviously they're looking at spending some money on the mid-level. That's still a decent amount of cash for an aging Danillo Gallinari. I think he adds some offensive capabilities, and as you alluded to, Nick, would be the 3B sort of guy. You've got Giannis, you've got Chris Middleton, you've got Brook Lopez, and then on the same sort of offensive sort of creation ability is a guy like Danilo.
Yeah.
And I think that's a decent sort of fit. They had Nikola Mirotic a couple of years ago that didn't work so well, but having
Gallinari is a better player overall.
He is, and having him for a full season rather than just half a season would certainly allow him to gel better than Mirotic did. And I still think it was worth the trade to sort of get him in the first place as well. So I think that's a proposition and a destination that could suit him.
If he's willing to accept the mid-level exception, which is a probability because he said that he wants to be in a contender. A lot of teams don't have money. Milwaukee makes a ton of sense.
Yep.
The Lakers kind of make a ton of sense too, just adding another offensive threat, another guy that can stretch the floor or something like that. I think there's going to be a lot of teams trying to get him to accept that mid-level exception, and if they can't, maybe they have to do that sign and trade with OKC, and he gets maybe that extra year or that extra $1 million or $2 million or something like that. So he's an intriguing guy that I think will be looking to get on one of those winning teams and could impact that contending race, playoff race, whatever you want to call it.
For sure.
But moving on from Gallo, we got number 8, Davis Bertans. Had an amazing season this year. Was one of the best.
Nick, please. Davis
Bertans. Okay, Jack.
There we go.
But Davis Bertans, amazing season. One of the best three-point shooters in the league. Probably had a better three-point shooting than Joe Harris. Just to throw it in your face, Jack, a little bit there. Can shoot off balance a little bit more. Has a little bit more height to his shot. Can shoot those fadeaways a little bit. So there you go, Jack.
Yeah, there you go, Nick Fay. I'm going to take over shareholder, stakeholdership.
I'm glad you're a teacher, Jack, to keep us all in line.
In saying that, I do agree, but just because Davis Bertans has more size about him, a guy who can shoot with that size, though Joe Harris, I think, has a bit more defensive IQ and acumen and effort. But in the system that Washington play, they're all offense. It's the Bill Murray style of basketball. They don't do defense. But Bertans sat out the Orlando bubble for this exact situation to get paid. And if he doesn't get paid a sum of $15 million or more by Washington or another team, I would be incredibly surprised. One of the two most, you've got him, you've got Joe Harris, and you've got, I guess, to a lesser extent, Danillo Gallinari. If Joe Harris is the guy that is following what he says that he wants to do, and Sean Marks pays up and Joe Tsai pays up, then the most available and best three-point shooter in a three-point shooting league is Davis Bertans. And that means that he's going to garner and clamor a heap of interest for a lot of teams. If it's Atlanta, if it's Charlotte, if it's New York, if it's Detroit, he's going to get paid because he has one of, if not the most important skill in a league where three-point shooting is probably the most valuable skill you can have.
At least for role players.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah, Davis Bertans, which it's funny how we have these, the top 10, because him and Gallinari, I feel like, are very similar in what they provide offensively. Obviously, Bertans being a little bit younger and Gallinari probably being the better all-around scorer because, looking at the shots, Davis Bertans takes 77% of his shots come from three, which is of no surprise, I don't think, to anyone here for a guy who shot 42% from three on the year. And another stat, 91% of his threes that he took this year were off assist. So I think that's also, when you're looking at places for like Davis Bertans to go to, you want to make sure that there's a decent team around him, even though he deserves to get paid. But if he was to go to like the Charlotte Hornets, he's not going to have the same type of production. And obviously,
baby, come on.
Of course, there are lesser teams that are not as good, and that's kind of expected. But I think Davis Bertans likely ends up back with Washington, and I feel like it would bolster Washington because, of course, the big question mark is, what does John Wall look like after not playing basketball for 2 years? And they could have a decent nucleus if John Wall's 85% of who he once was, because I think him being 100% after those major leg injuries is too hard to gauge. And then Bradley Beal, and then you add the flamethrower of Davis Bertans. As you mentioned, Jack, the Wizards are a very good offensive team, might get even better having a playmaker like John Wall to help him get better looks. But Davis Bertans, is a fantastic offensive player, a fantastic three-point shooter for today's NBA. It just depends on where he's going to go. But like you said, I think given what we're looking at, how important the stretch four position is, everyone could use a Davis Bertans on their roster.
Yeah, I think it'd be a major L for Washington if they don't retain him, because there was a lot of offers for him at the deadline, and they didn't want to trade him because they said, hey, we're going to re-sign Bertans. He's going to be our guy. We're going to compete next year. We're going to have John Wall. We're going to have Bradley Beal. So I think all signs point to him staying in Washington and maybe trying to add to his game a little bit in terms of not just being that off-ball three-point shooter, just, adding little wrinkles, kind of what we saw with Joe Harris in Brooklyn, and then picking up defensively, maybe getting a little bit stronger and trying to improve on that end because he's more of a four, and having a guy like him off-ball, making other bigs run around is a way to definitely tire out the defense. So I think he's a guy that could be a major plus, and if I'm Washington, I re-sign him. Worst case scenario, our season sucks. I trade him at the deadline, get a first-round pick easy.
The mold he should look to go towards is a guy that Kory would know closely, Bojan Bogdanovic. The defense that he has shown from his Brooklyn days up until his Utah days right now. Obviously, the key moments against Cleveland and LeBron in that Indiana series were awesome. And it's not to say that Nick and I know, we never thought of Bojan Bogdanovic as any semblance of a defender. In fact, he was a negative on that end. And that's what Davis Bertans is right now. But it's not to say that he can't get there. You can certainly, there is room for growth no matter how old you are in today's NBA.
Yeah, I think I would say Bogdanovic is probably a tad more athletic and a stronger player. So I think that kind of helps him. With Bertans could turn up the effort, and I think that would help him take that next step. I think Bojan, there was points in Brooklyn where you're like, oh, this guy could maybe be a decent defender. It was just so inconsistent. Whatever Nate McMillan did to him in Indiana to turn him into that guy was huge. And just maybe it's also being surrounded by good defenders. You know what I mean? Like, we talked about Washington. They play no defense. They have no plus defenders on that team. I can't really think of one off the top of my head. Right? Any plus defenders on Washington?
Bryant, no.
No, he's bad.
Shabazz,
No.
no. Ish Smith, nah.
No.
See, I don't know, man. I've got nothing.
They don't really have any good defenders. John Wall is probably their best defender, and obviously he's coming back from a major injury, so that kind of doesn't help either. You know, you're going to be exposed more in a system like that, but I would be surprised if someone else was able to sign Bertans.
Me too.
I would agree. It would be a major L for Washington, but it wouldn't necessarily surprise me if Bertans was like, I don't want to go back there also. But, like, again, it's all about the money with Bertans at this point.
Yeah. And moving on to number 7, we have Serge Ibaka. You know, obviously Ibaka's been a guy who played in OKC, was great, then got traded to Orlando, didn't really do much there, kind of looked like maybe he was washed. Then all of a sudden he ends up in Toronto, and he's kind of just been this great big and fits the modern NBA, can play the 4, can play the 5, can hit the three-point shot, can score inside. You know, Serge is a guy that I think a lot of teams are going to be looking to go for in this offseason.
The man who has been photoshopped aplenty by Nets fans on Twitter. There is no doubt about that. And the man who has provided Nick and myself copious amounts of hours of content talking about, will he take the MLE? Will he take the taxpayer MLE? Can there be a sign and trade? Now, it seems more unlikely by the day that Serge Ibaka will leave Toronto. I just think that it would be a similar sort of realm to what Miami's going to do with Goran Dragic. You know, give him a 1-year lump sum sort of deal, and then sort of, and he has said, you know, we saw recently, and this I said this on the Brooklyn Buzz as well. You know, he deleted his Instagram, he changed his bio and stuff, and then he came out on Twitter and said, you know, I didn't do anything. Come on, guys, hashtag We the North. And you know, you read into social media, we all do it probably a little bit too much. So it seems to me he wants to be in Toronto. I would be surprised if Toronto doesn't want him, with Marc Gasol likely heading back, if not already back in his home country of Spain. So it would be just, you know, you look at a team like, you know, so many teams like Nick mentioned could use anyone on the brink of contention. Nets, obviously Toronto right now,
Boston.
Clippers, Boston. Man, Boston would kill for a guy like Serge Ibaka. So with the Nets, again, you know, I'm wearing a Joe Harris freaking t-shirt. I'm going to talk about the Nets a little bit on this podcast.
He'd be really nice in the Clippers too.
He would, and you know, he's got. I just think that he's
a plug and play guy.
Yeah, he's got a couple of good years left in him as well. I thought that he was quite good in the Orlando bubble. You know, he's sort of the way he's diversified and developed his skill set from being like, you know, a sort of mid-range master to sort of, you know, really growing as a real defensive force in OKC, being like a defensive player of the year contender in a lot of ways, to maintaining that and now shooting the 3-ball at a really good rate. And, you know, he just wears cool scarves as well. I mean, my guy's got scarves. OG Anunoby calling you out, my guy. Serge Ibaka's scarf game might be a little bit better.
He's also just funny, right? Like that Kevin Durant interview, like chef interview they did, right? And
yeah, he has his own show.
Yeah. So Serge Ibaka is a fantastic now. I mean, like, is he a small ball 5? He's not a small ball 5. I mean, he's 7 foot, but he's been the perfect ideal transition from a power forward to a center. Right, already had the size. We already knew he had rim protection. Now he's not the same. He's not a blocker, right? The nickname of blocker. He's not the same guy from the OKC days, but can still stretch the floor. Can still play big time minutes when it comes to the postseason. And like Jack mentioned, I have a hard time seeing him leave Toronto, especially if Marc Gasol is gone. It just makes sense to keep Ibaka. You know, figure out who the center of the future is. Maybe if you're Toronto, but why get rid of Ibaka if you don't necessarily have that guy already? But again, you guys already labeled all the contenders that could use Ibaka. I don't have anything bad to say. This is a very good veteran, a very good locker room presence, a guy who can still score in a variety of ways because he's always had a solid jump shot to his game. Serge Ibaka is a very intriguing free agent on the market, but maybe not so much if he definitely, you know, is leaning towards re-signing with the Toronto Raptors because, again, as Jack mentioned, when he deleted all of his stuff on social media, I was like, oh, he's gone. You know, here we go. This is the start of it. And then, of course, you know, he's like, no, we the North. So it's like, oh, you don't do that to me. Don't play with me. But, yeah, Ibaka's going to be a guy to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I think one thing underrated probably is his like switchability too. Like he's a guy that could play in Game 7 of the NBA Finals and close in the fourth quarter just because of what he can do out there in the different aspects. And I honestly felt like Nick Nurse could have probably played him more against Boston. There was different games where he didn't even play 30 minutes, and he was playing Gasol like 30 minutes. And I'm like, Ibaka was severely outplaying him. So it'll be interesting. I'm not as confident as you guys that he'll stay in Toronto. I think there might be some more intrigue from Serge himself in terms of trying to find a contender. Because if he goes back to Toronto, they lose Marc Gasol, and just given how the rest of the East is going, I think they understand that they're probably not at the top of the East. They're probably not a contending team next year. You saw this year they just missed that scoring punch, and there's obviously the chance they can lose Van Vliet as well. So if they were to lose him too, then it's just like, oh, does Serge really want to go here? He's been a guy that's been rumored about the mid-level exception, and that'd be a steal for a lot of teams. So I think there's a possibility he could end up leaving the Raptors and being on next year's championship team, or at least one of those contending teams.
Called Kevin Durant his best friend, Nick. Best friend. Put it out there on Twitter. That tweet went semi-mini viral because, you take an 18-second clip out of a 4-minute interview and bang, bang. Let's extrapolate it and make things go crazy.
But I would say another thing with Ibaka, too, would just be like what is he looking for? You know what I mean? I don't think we necessarily know if he wants to be the contender. Does he want a big deal? Like he got some good money earlier in his career. The last contract he was on was pretty hefty. So he could be looking for money. He could be looking for a contender. Who knows? I could see one of these bad teams signing him and having him for a year and then moving him at the deadline or something like that. That's always a possibility, especially with the limited cap space. But on to number 6, we got Jerami Grant, a guy who made a lot of money for himself this postseason with Denver. Kory, I know you like him a lot, so you kick it off.
So I'm wearing orange, Syracuse orange. This is not a mistake. This is definitely not planned. I just wanted this to be clear. Jerami
he called
Grant
me this
awesome.
morning and said he was going to do it.
Damn, busted. Jerami Grant, fantastic, right? A guy like Philly that Philly let go at one point was with OKC, and we've seen him slowly blossoming. And let's just also point this out. When the Los Angeles Lakers eliminated the Denver Nuggets, who was the first player that LeBron James went up to? Jerami Grant. That was the first person that LeBron from the Nuggets went up to and started talking to his ear. Anthony Davis came over. Jerami Grant was fantastic in the Western Conference Finals. Really showed some good defensive impact. Obviously was outclassed going against, LeBron James and Anthony Davis, but had some really nice moments, and offensively has shown that, not somebody you can rely on as like a 1-3 option, but as a 4th or 5th option, can hit some threes. Is actually finished 68% around the rim. Within 3 feet was 68% around the rim. Only 33% on corner 3, so definitely needs to work on that a little bit from just 37% the year prior. But Jerami Grant is the perfect type of 3-and-D stretch 4 kind of guy. Market. Personally, I think he's actually better than the number 5 guy we're going to talk about in a second in terms of someone I would rather have on my team and somebody I would actually trust more. The guy won an award this past year I'm alluding to. We'll get to him in a second. I want to no teasers, not too many teasers. But Jerami Grant, somebody I think every single contender who's looking for someone who can provide threes and defense, 3-and-D will be somebody that they're calling because Jerami Grant provides so much on both ends of the floor and is still relatively young.
Yeah, he is. I think he deserves a lot of the hype. But one thing I'm questioning a little bit is how much do you buy into this small sample size, albeit in the most important time? Because throughout the whole season, he was good, but he wasn't amazing or sensational. Like, he doesn't deserve $20 million per year. And if I was his agent, I would be asking for that. I just think that, we don't want to get, or Denver doesn't want to get into a Bismack Biyombo sort of situation where it's like, all right, we saw Bismack Biyombo dominate for Toronto for like 4 games in a playoff series, and let's give him like $18 million a season, and then it'd be an absolutely toxic contract. Not saying that will happen. Trying to look at it from the other side of things that I don't think a lot of people probably do. He has been awesome. He was shooting the 3 ball really well. He had some nice offensive moments. That was probably the most surprising thing for me. Never questioned his defense. And, he's one of the better LeBron defenders in the league right now. I still don't think, he is, remarkable in that sense. But
he's not a lockdown defender. He's a good defender. He's not I don't think he did good against LeBron, but LeBron's also just missing some of that athletic pop. Like, there's other guys that I think, no disrespect to Grant, who was a good defender, I think would kind of cook him or make him look a little bit worse than we saw in that series.
Right.
He was kind of able to play to some of his advantages, and also, Denver's able to kind of close down the paint given the lack of LA's three-point shooter. So I feel like, Jack, you're onto something a little bit with the chance that he could get overpaid or get a little bit more money. I think his body of work is still more similar to what we saw. Like, there's still things that were like, okay, Grant, you were good in OKC. You had really good moments. I felt like parts of this year in Denver, early on, he wasn't really gelling, but I think more time with Jokic, more time in that system should really help him. He'll probably maybe get a slight overpay. I think Denver's definitely going to keep him because, like we alluded to when we were talking about Paul Millsap, it seems like Millsap's going to be out. Grant's a young guy, can really fit their scheme and also give them a lot of defense that they need because they just lack plus defenders on that end of the floor. And like you said, Jack, and like you said, Kory, there was a couple games in the Western Conference Finals where I think I even said on the recap, I don't expect Jerami Grant to have another 20-point game, and he did it 2 games later. So
yeah,
there's some moments where you're like, okay, maybe he's a little bit better than I thought. Maybe he's not. Maybe he's just a little inconsistent.
So something that I made a note of, and I wanted to bring it up, and it kind of goes with Jack's slight concern. Something that's promising to me is, he went from a starter role in OKC to only starting in 24 games this year with the Nuggets, primarily came off the bench, and playing 6 less minutes per game compared to last year with OKC, and basically put up the same exact numbers. And I think that's promising for the fact of, I don't know, I just think that's promising. The guy played less time but still was able to produce the same amount. So I think that's also somewhat promising for the fact of even in a smaller role, he didn't lose much of his production. And sometimes, we see that in different situations where a guy has a bigger role, goes to a different team, the role changes, and he kind of drops off. And it was promising not seeing that from Jerami Grant this past year.
And I think he understands who he is in the NBA. He's not going to try to overstep offensively. He knows that he's not a number 1, number 2, number 3 option. He's more of your 4th or 5th starter, trying to get those open cuts, trying to get those open threes, and doing some of that dirty work, attacking in transition type of thing. But any other thoughts on Grant or any possibilities of teams kind of trying to, steal him away from Denver?
I can't think of a heap off the top of my head. But the number of the contract is the thing that's probably been the sticking point in terms of if I were Tim Connolly, what would I offer him to retain him? And sometimes you have to pay overs to retain the player in the first place. So, his value is probably around the $14 million range per season, but I could see him getting 16, 17. And maybe, obviously the way contracts are structured, they're not flat out 16, 16, 16. They might be front-ended, they might be back-ended. And to me, Tim Connolly is one of the smarter executives in the league. So I expect him to do something that is beneficial to the Denver Nuggets in some way or another.
Do you think a bad team could make a move for him, Kory?
I mean, a team that pops up is like Atlanta.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
If Atlanta wanted to add defense while also keeping someone in the mix who can, spread the floor. Jerami Grant kind of fits the mold of what they're trying to do in Atlanta.
Especially if they want to move on from John Collins, which has been rumored for the last year.
Right. Another good point. The other, bad lottery-like teams, I don't see that many other teams making a move. Jerami Grant feels like a guy who's going to be on one of the big contenders that we've mentioned, several times already this episode.
Yeah, I think Charlotte would be a team that maybe pops in mind, just giving them some defense, still relatively young. I think Grant's still probably looking for a decent payday. I want to say his last contract was around $10 million a year. It was either a 2 or 3 year deal, nothing too crazy. So he's going to try to cash out if he can. Not a crazy idea for him would be signing a 1 year deal with Denver and then going to 2021.
For sure.
You know what I mean? There's going to be money there. He has another good season, more cap space, more opportunities to kind of go to another spot. But any thoughts on Grant before we move into the top 5?
Intrigued to see what that number is. It's probably the one thing that I'm most fascinated about his offseason.
Do you think he's a guy that probably changed his number more than anybody else in the postseason, or no?
I would say yes.
Yeah, I think that out of the guys that we've spoken about on this list, for me, Christian Wood had the best season to go from G League castaway, barely making the Detroit Pistons. Joe Johnson was ahead of him in the pecking order for a lot of it. To now, obviously we spoke about on the last on previous podcasts about that. But yeah, Jerami Grant, and we speak about it a lot. What are you doing for me in the postseason when it matters most? Jerami Grant did quite a bit.
Yeah, it's going to definitely be interesting. And I could make an argument for the next guy we're going to talk about. Maybe he lost more money than anybody else in the postseason, but we'll save that for the top 5.